Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast. I'm Rita Tritcher, senior business writer and columnist with the Globe and Mail, and I'm very pleased to be your moderator today. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the Globe and Mail's headquarters is situated on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. My colleagues and I are very grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities are leading the way. Indigenous Economic Development Board, there are more than 50,000 Indigenous-owned businesses in Canada, contributing $31 billion to the country's GDP. Through procurement, investment, and other supports, that number could reach $100 billion. Today's webcast is focused on strategies for Indigenous businesses to overcome barriers, tap into new opportunities for growth, and thrive in the digital economy. We aren't anticipating any technical issues, but we appreciate your patience should any arise. During the last 10 minutes of the webcast, we will be answering audience questions, so get them ready. If you have questions for our speakers, please type them in the virtual Q&A box that you see. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I would like to recognize MasterCard for supporting today's event. Who is the founder and CEO of Plato. Patrice Mousseau is the founder and CEO of Satya Organic Skincare. We also have joining us today, Caroline Hilton, the CEO and founder of Indigenomics Institute, the Global Center of Indigenomics and Global Indigenous Technology House, and Sasha Krishtik, President. I just want to hear a little bit about each of your perspectives as it relates to today's topic. We're going to start with Patrice, then we're going to hear from Keith, Caroline, and Sasha. Go ahead, Patrice.
Thanks, Rita. My name is Patrice Mousseau. I born and raised in Sioux-Lookout, Ontario, and I am a member of the Fort William First Nation and currently residing on the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation here in North Vancouver, BC. I am an Indigenous entrepreneur. I've been, I started in broadcasting, but I've been doing this for about 10 years now. It's been the ride of a lifetime, and there's definitely been a lot of learnings that I've managed to gather in that time, and I look forward to sharing with all of you what those are. Some of them, anyway. We don't have enough time for all of it.
Keith?
Hi, I'm Keith McIntosh. I'm the CEO of Plato Testing, which is an Indigenous software testing company that spans the country from Victoria to Charlottetown. I've been an entrepreneur for 30 years and with varying businesses and trying to grow and scale in the digital space. And the idea from Plato came from a conversation that myself and our co-founder, Denny Carrigan, had about how to bring wealth, sustainable wealth to individuals on reserve in Canada. And the governments can't do that, but entrepreneurship can. So we founded Plato to try and bring technical opportunities and entrepreneurship across the country.
Caroline?
Wonderful, thank you. My speakers weren't working. You can hear me fine? Wonderful, thank you. Thank you for bringing this conversation together, Caroline Hilton. I think this is such an important and timely perspective to bring into the national perspective, into national reality of the understanding of Indigenous entrepreneurs as a formidable force. And I would suggest that I think the actual number is considerably low in terms of that number that was provided, that in actuality, the demonstration of the significance of how many we're emerging Indigenous entrepreneurs we're seeing across a variance of sectors is really important to begin to see this rise as a formidable force and a place of engagement, of economic reconciliation and design of our relationships today. Thank you.
And Sasha.
Great. Thanks for having me today, Rita. From a MasterCard perspective, our mission is really to power economies and to empower people around the world. And so if we think about from a Canadian perspective, where we believe we can lean in, it's about building a digital, inclusive economy for all. And one of the big parts of our Canadian economy that has not had access to that has been our Indigenous population. Second to that, we know that the Canadian economy is driven by entrepreneurs and small businesses. And so when you put those two together, entrepreneurship and Indigenous entrepreneurs in particular, it's a really important topic. And I guess underlying that is we know that access to digital technology is a critically important part of entrepreneurship, and that is also an underrepresented area for many of our Indigenous entrepreneurs across the country. And so MasterCard believes we have an opportunity and an obligation to lean in and help amplify this very important conversation for change.
Okay, well, we've heard for years that access to capital is a problem that's been persistent, but I'd like to hear from each of you about what is your assessment of where we are now in terms of this access to capital. Is the problem more pronounced now than it was perhaps before the pandemic? Patrice, let's start with you.
Yeah, access to capital before the pandemic and now, it's still difficult. Especially as an Indigenous entrepreneur and as a woman Indigenous entrepreneur, it's even more difficult. You know, the numbers, and I'm sure Carolyn has this up the top of her hat, but you know, what is it, like less than 1%, 0.00, how much money is actually getting into the hands of Indigenous entrepreneurs? And I was looking at some numbers yesterday, and you know, we are starting businesses, Indigenous people are starting businesses here in Canada. More than 60% of our population is trying to achieve that, whereas only, I think it's less than 40% in the regular population. So this is a driving need in our community that needs to be addressed. You know, right now also there's not a lot of space for medium-sized businesses. There's, you know, very tiny pockets of money up to like maybe $5,000 for somebody if you're just starting that business, but it's that's very difficult to access. They make the hoops that you have to jump as a brand new business owner really, really difficult. And then the next leap is up into millions of dollars, where I think that for most of us, that's not necessarily what we want to be doing.
Yeah, so that you raise a good point about the medium-sized businesses being an area of need. Keith, what is your assessment of the access to capital issue?
Well, I think Patrice said it very well. I mean, I agree with a lot of what she said there. I think one of the things that is missing, not only besides the middle sort of medium amounts of money, is the sustainment. There's money to start a business, but sometimes it takes a considerable amount of time to become revenue positive, and so how do I go back to get a second tranche and to get me through the second year? The first year I've built my idea, I've started on down the path, but you know, that's a challenge. Is how do we get ongoing funding for growth and scale from one person to multiple people? There's lots of money once you get an idea that's scalable and can be shown to scale, but how do I get there? So that's one of the challenges I think is out there. You know, I think there's lots more sources than there used to be that people are willing to do it, but teaching people how to ask, teaching people where to ask, having the connections to go to the right place to ask is another challenge. Is if you have never borrowed money or have never had access, you don't know who to go ask and how to frame that ask in a way that is beneficial to the entrepreneur, that they still maintain a stake and a growth is always a challenge as well. So advisory services honestly helps. Sure, Patrice.
Yeah, I just want to like reiterate how important that point is that you just made. So many business owners, not only are we incredibly busy, but a lot of us have the attention span of gnats, right? So sitting down to do a whole bunch of paperwork is very difficult. So if we had somebody who was actually, you know, with us in this journey to go through that paperwork together to help us in this process, that would be extremely helpful, because also we don't have a lot of other people in our family or, you know, our extended community that have gone through these processes before. These are talking about a lot of like really first generation business owners. So I think that's an amazing point, Keith. Thank you.
It's true. Entrepreneurs have to multitask. I also want to hear from Carol Ann and then Sasha about the access to capital challenge and what your assessments are.
Yes, thank you. I think we're looking at an overemphasis on one side of the coin, which the consistent narrative is difficulty of access to capital for Indigenous entrepreneurs. And while that is absolutely true, and that is absolutely a lived experience, the second side of the coin also needs to be equally looked at and examined, and that is alignment of capital with Indigenous entrepreneurs. And there's less focus on that. And I think creating that space for that conversation, that while we've listened and heard, and the exercise of that experience of highlighting that story has been too long, and now it's time to focus on the other side of the coin, which is now alignment of capital to Indigenous businesses and being able to bring innovation, leadership space in a constructive, generative structures that facilitate real outcomes in the Indigenous economy and for Indigenous entrepreneurs.
Great, Sasha.
Building on that, if I may, on Carol Ann's point, I think the access to capital and how capital is funded is sort of the foundational question that the foundational challenge that many entrepreneurs have, as mentioned by Keith and Patrice. But I think we also need to think about the next step. There's a little bit about the what and the how. The what is getting access to capital, but the how is how do you get access to all of the other things you need to run a business, whether that's tailored financial tools, digital insights, mentorship, and to Patrice's point earlier, how do we make it simpler for entrepreneurs in general, and Indigenous entrepreneurs specifically, to have easier access, more one-stop shopping to those tools, so that they don't have to keep spending their very valuable multitasking time doing the administrative part of their business, as opposed to growing their customer base, marketing their business, and driving the business strategies that they've set out to achieve. So the combination of the what and the how.
And that's really true for any entrepreneur, really.
Exactly.
Yeah, but if I could just add a little bit more on, I guess what Carol Ann said is that, you know, if the money is encumbered, if you have to jump through a certain set of hoops that are specifically designed for one type of business, it may not fit into the business that you're trying to do yourself, or Indigenous culture or values. So a lot of the government, there are some very good programs out there that will help business to get started, but they come with a set of restrictions or rules that don't necessarily apply to an Indigenous business on reserve or any number of things. So some ability to get unencumbered money is critical to it as well, to an entrepreneur, because all of us as entrepreneurs want to be able to do whatever comes up today, not the way we want to do it. Part of the reason we're entrepreneurs is that we have our own ideas that we want to try and drive our businesses.
It's true. Each business has unique needs. I want to get back to a point that Carolyn raised. I mean, both of us talked about how Indigenous peoples are creating new businesses at rates that outpace the Canadian average. You pointed out that the official statistics might be actually conservative in terms of the number of businesses created. But how has the financial community responded to this? You know, what changes have we seen, Carolyn, from the banks and from other established financial players, and maybe some newcomers as well? What are you seeing?
Yeah, thank you. I think that there's increased listening, the exercise of listening, and what is that experience, and really paying attention to how the description and narrative of the need for scale, the need for early capital, the need for the advancement of the space overall, that funds that are intentionally directed to Indigenous people. I think we're seeing an increase of structures and partnerships. I think Scotiabank just identified a collaborative partnership of increasing access. I think we see groups like BMO that are advancing Indigenous pathways that support accessibility. And we see in the West groups like Van City who have been really long-term innovators in the reconciliation space, who are looking at focused approaches of solutions such as housing, or solutions that, listening to the communities, are actually bringing out foundational financial pathways in new and innovative ways. So I think the combination between listening, building structural responses to that, and building corporate accountability plans for those outcomes that are public, we're seeing a significant shift in that space that's identifying what is the leadership, what is the innovation, what is the accountability to those results. And I think that is significantly different than from what we've seen even over the past 5 years. Thank you.
So that's encouraging. Keith and Patrice, I mean, we talked about it on our prep call. We are hearing about this again today during this webcast, that, you know, the amount of capital available to businesses can range, you know, widely. Sometimes it's not enough, and sometimes it can be more than that. It's what's actually required given the business's stage and ambitions. Can you each tell me a little bit more about this challenge, you know, and what changes would better suit Indigenous-owned businesses? What are some tips to overcoming this challenge? Keith, let's start with you, and then Patrice, I'll jump to you.
I know I had a good answer for that when we did the rehearsal part of this, but I can't remember what it was now. You know, one of the changes around financial access is some of the number of Indigenous-owned or led investment vehicles. You know, one of the first investors in our company was Raven Indigenous Capital, and those, they're a VC, but they bring a patience, an understanding of some of the challenges that I know that, you know, MasterCard and banks and some of these are really helping and are really critical. But having an Indigenous lens on how the money is going to be returned, what the speed or commitment to result is important as well. Patrice, can you help me out here?
Yeah, you know what? I was actually remembering what you had said when we were speaking earlier, which was that, you know, basically delivering money almost like in tranches throughout the growth of your company, and being in partnership with your funders, right? Like, not necessarily somebody who's going to be taking equity from you or like trying to make a lot of money off of you via like interest payments or anything, but like a true partner, and helping the money to flow, because it's through flow that you actually grow economies, grow businesses, and grow relationships between people too. I feel like the whole process, especially when you're starting out very early, can be quite punitive almost. It's like, prove to me that you're good enough to have this money, where, you know, it can be very daunting, especially for people who are out there, you know, trying to see if their dream is worthwhile. So I think if it's more like less adversarial in that relationship and more relational, I think that would resonate more with Indigenous people. Yeah.
We're Plato is a national company. We're doing business all across Canada, and our clients are all around the world. So we're, you know, we had the advantage of been doing, as I said, for 30 years and had already had some networks and understood how to get them. But bringing money in and bringing advice and network, you know, smart money that brings. It's not just about taking equity out, but it's about bringing in connections, bringing about paths to market or advice to market is critical. Our business is bringing. I believe that technology is one of those ones that can the market reach can be around the world, but you have to know how to get that. You have to know how to find that piece of business, and investment that brings that sort of connection is really critical for companies as well.
And you know,
go ahead, Patrice. Go ahead.
I was just, you know, wanted to add that, again, you know, not every business needs to or wants to be a multi-billion-dollar business. There are businesses that you know, and what is still qualified as a small business is, you know, $5 million a year. I think that's plenty for a lot of people. That they, you know, if they had a business that was making $5, $10, $20 million, that is a wonderful business to have for them, for their community, for our economy. And I think we should be looking to support those types of businesses versus sending a whole lot of money through to the large multinationals, which are frankly just getting bigger and bigger and eating everybody else up. So I think if we had those supports and looking at how we support truly those small and medium businesses, that would be a benefit to everyone.
We're actually going to expand on that point in just a second, but before we do, Sasha, I want to bring you back to the conversation here, just to hear from you what MasterCard has done to adapt. What are you doing differently as a company to support Indigenous entrepreneurship?
So I think the first thing we did, going back to Carol Ann's comment, is we're listening. We want to make sure that we're leaning in and leveraging our assets appropriately. And we've had a lot of help and guidance along the way from Carol Ann and others. And in listening, what we have discovered is to the conversation around the importance of funding. We are a payments company in the technology space. We're not a bank, we're not a venture capitalist, so we don't do the funding mechanisms, but we've listened to what else do Indigenous entrepreneurs, what else are they telling us that they need? And so, as we've mentioned before, how do we drive sustainable growth, tailored financial tools, mentorship that aligns with their growth strategies, as well as their community and cultural values and goals? And so a big part of that has been, to Patrice's point, then, how do we leverage our company presence by building partnerships? So a couple of the partnerships that we think have been helpful are, we've partnered with One Feather, which is an Indigenous fintech company that is focused on digitizing community services on reserve and to the Indigenous population across Canada. Virtual Gurus is an incredible Indigenous-owned company. Bobby Rossett does a great job of building entrepreneurship and the capability for entrepreneurs to get access to virtual assistants to free up their time. So all the multitasking that Patrice and Keith need to do is managed a little bit better. So we help amplify that business. And we're also partnering with Carol Ann to make sure that we're leaning in on some of the research and the very important research that she's doing, particularly the new piece of research coming out around driving economic inclusion and growth for Indigenous businesses, so that we can create partnerships that amplify not only the needs, but amplify the solutions that will drive Indigenous entrepreneurship growth across Canada.
Sasha,
Okay.
I want to give credit where credit is due. You are a funding agency. I can tell you, true story. I funded payroll on my MasterCard for a couple of months.
We're glad to hear that, and I'm sure that the bank that partnered with you on issuing your MasterCard card would be very happy to hear that as well.
Okay, Patrice, I want to get back to the point that you raised, that not everyone wants to massively scale their businesses. Not everyone, thinks just strictly in that kind of large scale way. Do we need to think beyond the traditional models of venture capital when we think about entrepreneurship in that case? What do you think? Yeah,
Absolutely. The traditional models don't work. They've created a planet that is being just destroyed. It's creating masses of inequality in the world, and it's creating very weak and unstable economies. So, this is, it's unsustainable. So why don't we look at how do we recreate that system? How do we find a system that's actually going to benefit all of us and the country in order to have a strong economy? And that means supporting small and medium businesses, and not necessarily like the large businesses. So I think we need to reframe how lending is done, how grants are done, and look at seeing like truly what's going to work for people. And that starts with, I think, with a conversation.
Keith, I want to get you to weigh in on this as well. How do we need to rethink venture capital?
Yeah, I think we are rethinking. I think we are looking at different ways and different models. At least understand that there's not one right model. That there are multiple ways to do the same to achieve results, and don't be set in it has to be the way we did it yesterday. There's a way to do it tomorrow. I know that you mentioned One Feather, and I'm pretty good friends with Lawrence, who's the founder of that, and the idea of how to make capital or get access, or how to bring money faster to people when they need it is pretty critical to what he's trying to do. And
Absolutely.
there's different ways of doing it. There's not one venture cap fund that says, "I'll give you money. You have to return X on investment, and I have to get it out in 6 years' time or 7 years' time." Is the one way, but sometimes you just need a micro loan, or I need the money next week, and how do I do that without going through all the paperwork? So there's different kinds of funding. It's not just the one big tranche funding, I guess.
Yeah, there's so many different opportunities, right? Like but we need to change the narrative, because it's always just like, this is the way you do it. You get venture capital, you grow fast, you sell. And that is not the way that business can, if you can, like we talked about this, you can exchange time for money.
Yeah. And I grew up I grew up on a farm where it's all about time. You put it in and you harvest it later, and you do it every year. And I think that we sometimes do a disservice by telling people to get VC and build it and sell it. Why not build it and operate it? And why not build it and create stability for your employees, and then people have also a chance to grow. So, yeah.
Caroline, I see you nodding. Want to add anything?
Yeah, for sure. I think that we're seeing the emergence of Indigenous-led capital, where partnerships with Indigenous companies and innovative structures that are re-looking at the lens of impact in the investment. And I think it's really important to also understand the significance of the concept of an Indigenous business spans across generations, that what is being built is the architecture of changing the story within a family, within a nation, and the connection to Indigenous business in terms of the outcomes of the big, powerful why. That story that's been inherited, that's been less than positive, entrepreneurship in itself is a force to be able to do that. So looking at what is being invested and what is the impact, and how do we tell the story of that impact. Indigenous entrepreneurship doesn't fit within westernized concepts and measurements of impact necessarily. So I think to create that space where the realization of the continuation of Indigenous institutions that are leading Indigenous-led investment and partnerships, as well, equally important is the development of Indigenous-led institutions, that Indigenous people driving investments, partnerships, and the institutions to build the foundational success in the Indigenous economy is essential, so that agency and the ability to facilitate a pathway forward, that it's not a piecemeal approach or government funding or all the stipulations that was discussed in terms of the early stage investment and development process that we experience. Thank you.
Sasha, I wanted you to also weigh in on this idea of thinking beyond traditional models of venture capital. I know you said that MasterCard's not necessarily focused on the funding aspect of it, but you're a business person. What's your thoughts on thinking broadly about this issue?
I think Carol Ann summed it up really nicely, is that we have a traditional historical system that isn't necessarily fitting what our Indigenous entrepreneurs across the country are telling us they need to grow. You heard it directly from Keith and Patrice as well. And so I think it's incumbent upon those of us that lead and participate and work for some of those more traditional companies to listen and to pivot. And what we're really hearing is, if we listen carefully to the fact that, as Patrice says, we need to understand how businesses want to grow, whether it's to grow to sell or to grow to sustain their communities. If we listen to Keith's comment around how funding is required, is it required to start? Is it required to scale? Is it required for an infusion because you need to pivot your business or you've had an unexpected change in your business? If we listen, the answers are actually very clear. And now it's a matter of rallying, I would think, and this is where Caroline is doing some incredible work on Bay Street in Toronto, is rallying both the voices of our Indigenous companies and Indigenous entrepreneurs alongside with our historical traditional businesses across the country to create a new model for growth. It's entirely possible. It starts with listening, leaning in, and then acting. And I think we're on a really good path. We just need to continue to build the momentum and bring more people into the circle. The relationships that Patrice mentioned are really foundational to this, is bring more people into understanding the desire and the need for these relationships, and the model will shift.
So part of this is also learning from examples of success. Carol-Ann, there are small towns like Osoyoos in BC and Huayat on Vancouver Island. There are some examples of successful Indigenous economies. I'd like to hear a bit from you about what the building blocks were of their success.
Yeah, that's such a great and important question. Thank you. I think that we need to enter into Canadian reality the concept of Indian Act economics, that it's a force field that works against the concept of economy itself. And I think that as we see these successful nations building foundational economies and the strength of their businesses, you'll see that downplay of the role of the Indian Act itself within pulling against the foundation of building an economy. So we see examples like Wyatt Nation on Vancouver Island. Obviously, I think they're self-governing and having the ability to facilitate land ownership and value creation processes that they own, design, and deliver. And I think it's when it's Indigenous-owned, Indigenous-led that we're seeing the space where value can be created in specific ways and designed. It's really important to look at that as well in terms of the increasing role of land transfers, where historically through the Indian Act we see the absence of the structures of value creation, whereas now we're seeing with increasing land transfers and historical injustice settlements, the land and cash transfers are foundational to nations being able to identify a pathway forward that's supporting value creation and a strategic nation building focus. And that in itself is building a ecosystem of supporting businesses, either that are auxiliary to the nation's businesses, or that's also we're seeing this army of Indigenous entrepreneurs also rising to respond to a local Indigenous economy. So I think there's a spectrum of processes in there, self-determination, nation building, the agency to respond and have the access to businesses becomes really important. I also just want to reflect, I think that as we see this increasing dynamic and environment of corporate economic reconciliation, it's just equally important to understand that a fundamental response is the development of infrastructure to support a local Indigenous economy. And we see the advancement of the infrastructure, and we look at companies such as TELUS who've done an amazing job really advancing the whole line around what a corporate response is. And I think in that exercise of listening, the significant development of investing into connectivity and accessibility for nations provides the space for Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses that wasn't previously available. So understanding the impacts of investment into infrastructure and the accessibility, as well as the corporate response to build an environment of reconciliation, are all fundamental. So I mentioned a significant kind of numbers of aspects in there, but it's all this return to agency as nations, and where Indigenous businesses are able to see a space. And I think that in my trip to Osoyoos, as the example that you provided a number of years ago, in being hosted by young adults in the community to do tours of the businesses, I really recognized that what these young people were doing was describing their place in the community, and that they saw themselves as having a role. They saw themselves as having a pathway to education, and they saw themselves as what was next for them within their journey of applying their education to what was needed within the community. So just as important with that, of which I'll close my comments, are that young people need to see themselves in our future, and to see that as businesses, I think, is an essential component and that ability to facilitate that for young people, for their education pathway, for their role, and for their possibility that business is a choice and business is an option, I think is essential. And that's where we're seeing a significant amount of potential of younger people starting businesses and connecting that both to community and within urban settings. Thank you.
That actually is a perfect segue to my next question, which is for Keith. Because one of the things you've talked, of course, Patrice.
Really very quickly to that. I think Carolyn is 100% right. Story is so important. My brand, Sati Organic, we just launched in all the Shoppers Drug Marts across the country. Okay, it's 1,100 new stores, biggest beauty and personal care retailer in Canada, but they didn't care that we were a First Nations company. But it's important, and it's still a story that needs to be told, because then other First Nations companies are like, oh, this is a pathway for me too. This is a shelf that I can be on. So again, I think we just need to be amplifying a lot of these incredible stories that are out there. Like, I know so many amazing Indigenous entrepreneurs that I think, you know, all of Canada needs to know about. And I apologize. And
no, not at all. I mean, having role models is that's, you know, the importance of that cannot be understated. But Keith, I wanted to ask you, in terms of, you know, entrepreneurship, one of the things that you've talked about is getting more kids into STEM. Maybe you can connect for the audience why this has such an essential role to play in Indigenous economic growth.
I think that STEM education is absolutely critical to so much of our life today, particularly in entrepreneurship. So technology can be taken anywhere. It can go to the furthest community or the most remote community, or it can be done downtown cities. And I fully respect small businesses and medium, but I'm in a larger business, technology business. But it has impacts on local communities too. We have a young man who took a training in downtown in Regina, and then COVID came, he went back to his First Nation in Flying Dust in northern Saskatchewan, and now he's getting paid. That's a $60,000 or $70,000 salary and benefits, and that money is coming into the community of Flying Dust from away. It's not, you know. So a lot of entrepreneurs and their valid business and great business, local businesses, but ones that are bringing money from away have the compounding effect of being able to bring that $60,000 or $70,000 and spend it on local businesses around in the local communities. And so technology enables that. So STEM, math, science, it's the one piece that we can take and learn anywhere and deliver the services anywhere. When we decided, how do I take entrepreneurship to reserve, we thought it had to be technology entrepreneurship, because to be a successful business, you need to have a market as well. It's not just about doing the work, but how do I access a bigger market and a broader pool of money to make my business become successful, so I can sell my product or my service. So what we saw when we started a business is we couldn't go out and hire First Nations or Métis programmers or developers or whatever in the numbers we needed, because the kids don't see it as a career, so they haven't been taking it as much. So we built a course and we try and deliver in the communities so that people start to see it as a viable career path. Certainly not for everybody, but it's an important part of it.
About what Keith is saying is, he and Plato have done an outstanding job of investing in STEM, but it can't be on the backs of the entrepreneurs who are already busy launching and growing their businesses. So back to the theme of partnership, this is where we can look across the country and see what are the organizations that are driving STEM education and how can we help partner and amplify them. So Actua, for example, is one of the country's longest standing and sort of most deepest embedded across the country in unlocking the potential of youth in science and technology and STEM. They have an incredible program called In STEM, which is Indigenous Youth in STEM, that they run in 200 companies across 200 communities across the country. They've had 35,000 students go through. We're a very proud partner of Actua. And I mention that because it starts with making sure that we're getting youth involved and interested and committed to STEM at a much earlier age, not when they're graduating from university or graduating from high school and then figuring out what is the job I'm going to do. So bringing them in and really using STEM to give youth a view to the range of options that they have at their disposal, which may be engineering, it may be entrepreneurship, it may be the both at the same time if you can combine them. But that notion of taking partners across the country to amplify and bring in more STEM education is really, really critical.
Absolutely combine them. I having as a skincare company, we use STEM, engineering all the time. We're currently looking at developing a robotic system that's going to help us eliminate plastic waste, hopefully for not just our company, but for more companies in the beauty and personal care space. And I think we need to broaden that perspective of what the perception of STEM is. It's not just about writing software. I mean, let's face it, AI is going to be writing all our software in the next 10 years anyway. It's really about being comfortable with those tools so you can use your imagination to take them anywhere you want to, right? And I think, we need to also just open up that perspective so people think that, yes, STEM is definitely for you. It's for everyone.
So we have less than 15 minutes left. I have one final question for all of you before we go to audience questions. So people in the audience, please get your questions ready. I see some of them are already trickling in. But before we get to the audience questions, want to hear from Patrice, starting with you, then Keith, Caroline, and Sasha. What is one piece of advice you have for someone thinking about becoming an entrepreneur?
I'm going to say build your community. Build your network. And I don't mean network in like a networking kind of a way. I mean, like build your relationships, because you want to be in relationship with people for over the long period. You cannot have a successful business in a vacuum. You need to have those relationships for sure.
I have a glib answer to that. Entrepreneurship, like how do I run a successful business? How do I go? Is like saying, what's the one piece of advice to win a game of chess? Start. You just have to start.
That's great.
Yeah.
Caroline?
I would say have a courage-o-meter, your personal courageous response to what you're building. There are so many kind of negative constructs of failures of business. Know yourself, I know that as an entrepreneur, not every single day you show up as your most courageous self, but building that network around you that is a strength-based approach to what you're building and create that network around you, I think is equally important, and that just as much as the hard skills are essential to business success, I think the internal state of managing that sense of courage, particularly as Indigenous people who've been entirely told that we can't do this, or external definition of our experience. And I think the actual amount of courage it takes to be an Indigenous entrepreneur is entirely admirable and formidable force that is being built right now. And I think that ownership of the sentence, I am an Indigenous entrepreneur, is so powerful. And to be able to create that definition and response to what is being built and changing that story, it's so deeply connected to our history. It's so deeply connected to our experience, and that courage and a strength-based narrative and that ecosystem around you that reflect that back to you, I think is essential. Thank you.
Sasha, what's your piece of advice?
My advice would be to embrace technology and build strong partnerships. In today's digital economy, it doesn't matter how big or small your business is, what sector your business is, technology can be a game changer, particularly for businesses in remote areas. And as you've heard from so many of the panelists, the need for partnerships, relationships, networks, whatever you want to call it, the more you can bring in organizations and communities and people who can support your vision, who can support your courage, who can support your desire, the greater success you have. We've always heard that it takes a village, and that applies to so many things in life, particularly entrepreneurship.
Okay, I'm going to start taking questions from the audience. This first question is from a company called Ravensong Soap and Candle. And the question is, how do we approach companies for corporate gifting? Recently, we have been receiving larger and larger corporate orders for 5,000 to 15,000 and wish to grow in this area. Any advice? Who wants to take this?
I mean, I think it should be Sasha, because you guys should be doing tons of corporate gifting inside the Indigenous community.
I mean, I'm happy to take it. I will say we do. I'm proud to say that over the last number of partner events that we have run, all of our corporate gifts have involved Canadian Indigenous entrepreneurs. So from a MasterCard perspective, Ravensong team, you're welcome to reach out to me. But more specifically for any Indigenous business that is looking to grow in corporate gifting, I think it's a matter of building a list and a target list and reaching out to companies, usually through their marketing and communications arms, to build those relationships and be known, because we are sourcing, many of us are sourcing those partners, and we're looking for a range of partners that reflects coast to coast to coast geographically, that reflects different types of gifts. And so this goes back to the conversation we had earlier about building partnerships and networks. It takes two hands to shake, so reach out your hand so that one of us in the corporate world can be the other hand that shakes.
Hey, Keith, a question for you from the audience. What role does procurement have to play in growing Indigenous-owned businesses?
I think that procurement could have a huge role in growing and helping to grow Indigenous businesses, because one of the challenges is having connections. One of the challenges is being able to compete on a level playing field that isn't level. You know, the Indigenous businesses tend to be smaller. They tend to have less experience than some of the ones that have been the multinationals that are there. You know, so how do we compete? The federal government's procurement policy is meant to say that some amount of the contract should be set aside for Indigenous businesses to have a first shot at, or give them a leg up to get started. But it's not just a checkbox. It's meant to be building capacity and wealth in Indigenous communities, Indigenous people, so they can, in the future, compete without the help. So the procurement policy needs to be strong, and it needs to be true to the purpose, not just a checkbox with a way to work around it. And I think that we've seen a lot of this happening in ArriveCan and really many others. And we do a lot of work, or try to do a lot of work with federal departments, and the government needs to make sure that people are staying true to the spirit and intention, and not just the checkbox in those rules. But done right, it should be building a future where Indigenous businesses compete and win successfully on their own validity of being a business.
Okay, one for the panelists, whoever wants to take this, let me know. Can the panelists speak to challenges and opportunities they see for growing Indigenous-led manufacturing in Canada? Who wants to take that on? Caroline?
I'm really excited to see, I think there was an announcement today of the federal government of an investment into this Indigenous manufacturing network, and seeing that as an institution that supports an environment that's advancing that particular sector and building the structures for inclusion, I think is a admirable demonstration of what is possible when invested in. With that announcement, I think there's this recognition of the potential of what impact can be created through investing into these institutions that are supporting the supply chain, really, within a regional economy, and what Indigenous inclusion looks like in that. Thank you.
Okay, Patrice, question for you. What resources and tools have helped play a big role in helping your business to grow?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. God, you know what? There have been so many people who have helped me along the way to get where I am. So many organizations like SheEO, which is now called Corliss. We're talking about the Trade Commission a fantastic organization here that is provided to us as Canadian businesses free of charge by the government to enable us to be exporting, for example. And I would highly recommend reaching out to your trade commissioner to see if exporting is something for you, because it's definitely something that can be there for everyone. You know, I think about my own community and also my community of entrepreneurs who have been there when things are great and when things are really bad. Like I said, you know, you really need supports coming from everywhere in order to be to keep going. You know, and that's the key. You just have to keep going, for sure.
Actually, you raise a great point about trade, because that's one of the things that we've written about here at the Globe, is that we have these great trade agreements as a country, including the CETA agreement with the European Union. And, you know, while we're seeing European businesses really trying to take advantage of it, we're not seeing necessarily the same the same from the Canadian businesses, the same rate of trying to capitalize on those trade agreements to the same extent. So that's a great point about manufacturing and exporting. What solutions should the Canadian government and other influential institutions be investing in to help grow Indigenous businesses? Who wants to take that on? Carol-Ann?
One thing that I pay particular attention to when it's federal budget time of what's being invested into is when we look at this concept of the Indigenous socioeconomic gap, the perception of Indigenous peoples as a problem or a cost to the system is prevalent within this perspective, and how that language and action and the funding models are shaped. But when we look at actual investment into structures of the Indigenous economy, the most recent examples of those include, I think, like the Indigenous Growth Fund as a investment into larger scale development for Indigenous businesses. So when we look at the balance between social programming, administration, and actual structural investments into the Indigenous economy, it's critical that we begin to look at that perspective in terms of that ability to design and build outcomes specifically.
Does anybody else have anything to add on, you know, the wish list for government or influential institutions?
I would add from my perspective, Rita, I think the first step is many of us that work for large institutions and to a degree government, I think we need to recognize that we're on different places on this journey of recognizing the importance of economic reconciliation and the importance of what role we have an obligation to play. Once a company does that, I think the next step that we're hearing is, how do we work, and we're, I think, very early in this journey, but how do we work together to build better coordination so that, and this is true not only for Indigenous entrepreneurs, but for all entrepreneurs, probably the number one piece of feedback we hear is, when there are programs that are helpful to us, it's a lot of work for us to access those programs. And so how do we, with all the best intentions across all of the financial institutions, technology companies, telcos, and many, many more, including government, how do we work together better to make all the access to these wonderful programs that we're trying to put into place or create amplification for? How do we make it easier for our entrepreneurs across the country to access?
You know, this was actually a great question. Put forward to me. I'm sorry, I'm be fast, I promise, Keith. Was put forward to me actually by David at BDC just a couple weeks ago. You know, how do I make this process easier for people? And I have ADHD. So for me, it really literally is about sitting down and going through the process of how to access capital with these organizations. So it was David and Aaron from BDC who sat down with me in a great big whiteboard, and we went through the numbers together. And it took maybe an hour of their time, but it was a pivotal moment for me because now I feel like I'm in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So taking that time, instead of saying, oh, you know, just the money's there, why don't you just apply for it? Think changing your perspective a little bit and trying to meet people where they're at, I think is where, you know, that conversation needs to go.
Yeah.
We just have 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to give Keith the last word.
This is so key to what I think. You know, I don't think there's a single company, there's a single CEO in Canada that doesn't want to be part of this, to help, to offer. But it's not enough to say I want to help. It's not enough to say the door's open, come in and work. Because Indigenous, but when we go into a MasterCard, we use MasterCard example, it's not enough to say, yes, come work for us. There's a reason we're not, Indigenous people aren't there now. And it's, if you have to have patience. You have to maybe change the way you do work. Indigenous people don't have as much experience in the white collar world and technology world. They don't have maybe the same set of education, but I can train somebody to get in the door, but they're not going to have that master's degree from Queen's, maybe. And this guy, so you have to, it's not enough just to say the door's open. It's, you have to change the way you do work. Maybe you have to change. COVID allowed us to change where we do work, which is helpful. But it's not just where; it's how we do work. What are the prerequisite requirements before you even consider hiring me? Is it, what do I really need, and what have we set up to limit to a certain group of people that just went to university? So it's being willing to change, being willing to do things in a different way than we had before, and being patient and letting our Indigenous entrepreneurs, our Indigenous workers learn that path. Because it doesn't, so much is taken for granted that we might not know, that the Indigenous people might not have enough experience, but they can get there if you give them that chance.
Unfortunately, folks, we're going to have to leave the conversation there because we're out of time. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I would like to thank Keith, Patrice, Carol-Ann, and Sasha for joining us today for this very important discussion. I would also like to thank everyone in the audience for attending, your patience with our technical difficulty, and also for all of the great questions that you provided for our speakers. And of course, our thanks to MasterCard for supporting today's webcast. We will be sharing the link to the recorded webcast in about 1 week's time. Thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.